Behind the closed doors of apartment 213, Jeffrey Dahmer hid a darkness the world had never seen. What turned an ordinary boy into one of history's most feared killers? The quiet neighbor, the man who blended into the crowd, carried secrets so disturbing, they would shock an entire nation. For years, whispers of strange smells, haunting cries, and unanswered questions went ignored, until the truth finally burst into the light. Tonight, we step into the shadows of Jeffrey Dahmer's life. From his unsettling childhood, to the horrors that unfolded inside his apartment, and the trial that exposed his twisted obsessions to the world. We'll unravel the chilling story of Jeffrey Dahmer, his dark descent, his capture, and the legacy of fear he left behind. This is the dark story of Jeffrey Dahmer. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on bell notifications. Let's go. Every story of darkness has a beginning. For Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, that beginning was in the quiet suburbs of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Born on May 21, 1960, Dahmer entered the world seemingly ordinary. But beneath the surface of his childhood, shadows were already forming. His father, Lionel Dahmer, was a chemist, analytical, precise, but distant. His mother, Joyce, struggled with her own mental health, often consumed by depression, anxiety, and emotional outbursts. The home was rarely a place of warmth. Instead, it was filled with arguments, medication bottles, and long stretches of silence. As a boy, Jeffrey was shy, withdrawn. Neighbors would later describe him as polite, but strangely disconnected. He wasn't the child laughing with friends on the playground, or chasing after adventures in the neighborhood. Instead, Dahmer often lingered at the edges, watching, observing, but rarely participating. And then, came the animals. From an unusually young age, Jeffrey developed a fascination with what most children would run from. While others collected toys or baseball cards, Dahmer collected roadkill. He would walk along back roads searching for dead animals, dragging them home in bags, and dissecting them with a surgeon's precision. Bones, organs, skulls, these were not objects of horror for him. They were treasures. To Jeffrey, the bones made music. He liked the sound they made when rattled together. He would bleach them, polish them, and keep them hidden in jars. What others saw as grotesque, he saw as beautiful. When asked why, Dahmer would later admit, "I was curious about how animals fit together. I wanted to see what they looked like inside." But curiosity can cross into obsession. In the Dahmer home basement, jars of animal remains began to pile up. The sharp smell of chemicals his father brought from work mixed with the stench of decay. Few noticed. Fewer still dared to ask questions. Meanwhile, Jeffrey was growing increasingly isolated. His parents' marriage was unraveling. Bitter arguments filled the air. By the time he was in his early teens, the divorce was inevitable, leaving Jeffrey caught in the middle, silent, neglected, and alone. Neighbors would sometimes see him wandering aimlessly. His classmates remembered him as awkward, distant, and often the target of cruel jokes. To some, he became invisible. To others, just a strange kid with a blank stare. But underneath that blank stare was a boy developing a dangerous inner world, one that no one was watching closely enough. And then, another red flag appeared. Jeffrey began to fantasize. Not just about animals anymore, but about control, possession, and dominance over others. He admitted later that by the time he was a teenager, thoughts of murder had already entered his mind. It was a chilling evolution, from curiosity about the dead, to dark fantasies about the living. And here's a question to you, the viewer. If you saw a child fascinated with dissecting animals, dragging roadkill home to preserve it, would you see it as harmless curiosity, or as the warning sign of something much darker to come? Tell us in the comments. But for Dahmer, these warning signs were ignored. He slipped through the cracks, seen, but not understood. His fascination with death only deepened, and soon, it would no longer be enough to examine lifeless animals. Jeffrey Dahmer's obsession was only beginning. And soon, it would turn deadly. By 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer was 18 years old. On the surface, he was just another teenager about to graduate high school. But beneath the surface, his mind was already drowning in fantasies of control, death, and possession. And on a warm summer evening, those fantasies became reality. It was June 18, just 3 weeks after graduation, when Dahmer picked up a hitchhiker, 19-year-old Stephen Hicks. Stephen was a cheerful, music-loving young man, simply trying to get to a rock concert. For Dahmer, though, Hicks became more than just a stranger on the side of the road. He was the opportunity Dahmer had been waiting for. Dahmer invited Hicks back to his family's house, promising a few drinks and some company. For hours, they talked, drank, and played music. But as the night wore on, Stephen grew restless. He wanted to leave. Dahmer didn't want him to go. In that moment, his fantasies and reality collided. Grabbing a dumbbell from his basement, Jeffrey struck Hicks from behind, crushing his skull. He then strangled him with the bar of the weight, listening as life slipped away. Stephen Hicks had become Dahmer's first victim. Panicked, Jeffrey hid the body in the crawl space before later dismembering it. With chilling calmness, he stripped the flesh, crushed the bones with a sledgehammer, and scattered the remains in the woods near his home. No one suspected a thing. Hicks simply vanished from the face of the earth. For Dahmer, the act was intoxicating. Later, he would confess, "I didn't want him to leave. That's why I killed him." But after that first murder, something strange happened. Rather than immediately seeking another victim, Dahmer retreated into himself. The guilt, the fear of being caught, and the collapse of his family's home life left him in limbo. For nearly 9 years, there were no confirmed murders. Yet his urges never left. They only simmered beneath the surface. During this time, Dahmer attempted to live a normal life. He enrolled in Ohio State University. But his drinking spiraled out of control, and he dropped out after just one term. In 1979, he enlisted in the U.S. Army, training as a combat medic in Germany. For a brief moment, it seemed structure might save him. Discipline, order, responsibility. But once again, the bottle had other plans. Dahmer's drinking worsened. His performance declined. Fellow soldiers began to avoid him. And eventually, after just 2 years of service, the Army discharged him, quietly, honorably, but with a problem. They sent him back into civilian life with no direction, no treatment, and no plan. Shocking fact, years later, 2 men would come forward claiming that Dahmer had assaulted them during his time in Germany, suggesting that his darkness never truly rested, even in uniform. Back in the United States, Dahmer drifted. He lived with relatives, worked odd jobs, and sank deeper into alcoholism. He was arrested more than once for indecent exposure, disorderly conduct, even sexual assault. Each time, he slipped through the cracks, receiving light sentences or probation. And yet, through all of this, his murderous urges grew stronger. Dahmer himself admitted later that during these years, he fantasized constantly about killing again. But somehow, he restrained himself. For almost a decade, the world was unaware that a killer walked among them. He was quiet. He was invisible. He was the man on the bus, the coworker stocking shelves, the neighbor who kept to himself. But urges that dark cannot stay buried forever. And in 1987, the darkness inside Jeffrey Dahmer returned, stronger, more violent, and more obsessive than before. For nearly a decade, Dahmer managed to live unnoticed. But what came next would mark the beginning of a spree so horrific, the world would never forget it. After nearly a decade of silence, Jeffrey Dahmer's murderous urges finally clawed their way back to the surface. And when they did, there was no turning back. It was 1987, and Dahmer was living at the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee. One night, at a local bar, he met 25-year-old Stephen Twomey. Dahmer later claimed he didn't remember how it happened, that he woke up next to Twomey's lifeless body, beaten and strangled. Whether blackout or denial, the truth was clear: Dahmer had killed again. This time, he dismembered Twomey's body in a hotel room, packed the remains in a suitcase, and carried them back to his grandmother's house, where he lived at the time. There, in her basement, he performed acts of horror that no one in the family suspected. It was the beginning of a spree that would stretch from 1987 to 1991, a spree that would claim the lives of 16 more men. What made Dahmer's crimes particularly haunting was not just the violence, but the vulnerability of his victims. Many were young men of color, often struggling financially, socially, or seeking acceptance. Dahmer preyed on these men in bars, clubs, or on the street, luring them with promises of money, alcohol, or photographs. Some names etched forever in history. James Dockstader, only 14 years old. Richard Guerrero, 22. Anthony Sears, 24. Eddie Smith, 36. Ricky Beeks, 27. And many more. These men were more than names on a list. They were sons, brothers, friends, dreamers with futures that Dahmer snuffed out. Dahmer's approach was disturbingly calculated. Once inside his apartment, he would offer drinks laced with sedatives. When his victims slipped into unconsciousness, he strangled them, often with his bare hands. Afterward came dismemberment. Carefully. Methodically. He used knives and saws, boiling pots and chemicals, breaking bodies down piece by piece. And then, the preservation. Dahmer didn't just kill. He collected. Skulls, bones, preserved organs, all stored in his apartment. He photographed his victims at every stage: alive, unconscious, dead, and dismembered. Polaroids stacked in drawers, hidden until police would one day find them. Apartment 213 became a house of nightmares. Inside that small, one-bedroom apartment sat human remains in refrigerators, skulls on shelves, acid-filled vats for dissolving flesh. The smell was overwhelming. Neighbors constantly complained of a foul odor. Some described it as rotting meat. Others, as sewage. Dahmer always had an excuse: spoiled food, bad plumbing, tropical fish gone bad. And somehow, people believed him. Imagine it, dozens of complaints filed, countless visits from the landlord, yet no one ever looked deeper. The horrors of apartment 213 remained hidden, even as the stench of death filled the building. Perhaps the most heartbreaking truth of Dahmer's reign of terror is how many times he could have been stopped. In 1991, one of Dahmer's would-be victims, 14-year-old Konorak Sinthasumphone, managed to escape. Neighbors found the boy naked, bleeding, incoherent, and desperate for help. Police were called. But when Dahmer approached the officers, calm and composed, he explained that Konorak was his adult lover who had simply had too much to drink. The police believed him. They escorted the boy back into Dahmer's apartment. Within minutes of their departure, Dahmer killed him. This single failure of law enforcement became one of the darkest stains on Milwaukee's history. How many lives could have been saved if the police had looked just a little closer that night? And Konorak was not the only case. Time after time, Dahmer slipped away. His calm demeanor, his ability to appear ordinary, masked the monster within. To his neighbors, Jeffrey Dahmer was strange, but not terrifying. He kept to himself, sometimes sharing a beer, sometimes offering friendly conversation. He worked various jobs, clocked in, clocked out, appeared normal enough. At bars, he was quiet, awkward, even forgettable. But once the door of apartment 213 closed behind him, the mask fell away. Inside, Dahmer lived out his darkest fantasies: murder, necrophilia, cannibalism. The quiet neighbor was, in reality, one of the most prolific killers the United States had ever seen. This dual existence, ordinary man on the outside, nightmare on the inside, is what kept Dahmer hidden for so long. For 4 long years, Jeffrey Dahmer carried out his crimes, leaving behind a trail of shattered families, unanswered questions, and a community haunted by what went unnoticed. Could these murders have been stopped earlier if police had acted sooner? If neighbors had pressed harder, if authorities had looked deeper, how many lives could have been spared? It's a question that lingers to this day. But by July of 1991, Dahmer's world of horror was about to collapse. His crimes had gone on for too long, and fate was about to intervene in the most unexpected way. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you have not. July 22, 1991. A night that would finally end the horrors of Jeffrey Dahmer. That evening, Dahmer walked the streets of Milwaukee hunting for his next victim. At a bar, he approached 32-year-old Tracy Edwards. With his usual soft-spoken charm, Dahmer lured Tracy back to apartment 213, promising money, drinks, and photos. But once inside, Tracy sensed something was wrong. The air was thick with an unbearable stench. Strange boxes lined the floor. And on the table, bottles of chemicals and a sinister blue barrel filled the room with a sickly odor. Then Dahmer appeared with handcuffs. He clasped one around Tracy's wrist. Tracy struggled. Terrified, Dahmer pulled a knife. He told him he wasn't going anywhere. For hours, Tracy Edwards sat in that apartment of death, listening to Dahmer's twisted ramblings about control, about power, about never wanting people to leave him. But Tracy was different. He didn't freeze. He stayed calm, spoke softly, and looked for a chance. Finally, when Dahmer's guard slipped, Tracy made his move. He punched, shoved, and ran through the apartment door, handcuffs still dangling from his wrist. On the street, he flagged down 2 police officers. At first, they thought it was just a domestic dispute. Another drunken fight between men. But Tracy begged them to come with him, to see for themselves. Reluctantly, they followed him back to apartment 213. What they found inside shocked them to their core. When the officers entered Dahmer's apartment, the smell hit them instantly. One officer glanced around and saw Polaroid photos scattered on a nightstand. They picked them up, only to realize they weren't ordinary photographs. They were images of men. Dismembered. Every stage of Dahmer's crimes had been captured, the unconscious, the dead, the dissected. As the officer flipped through the stack, his hands shook. These weren't just fantasies. This was evidence. He turned to his partner and whispered the chilling words, "These are real." In seconds, the officers drew their guns. Dahmer tried to fight, but they pinned him down. The nightmare of apartment 213 was finally over. But the photographs were only the beginning. As investigators combed the apartment, they uncovered horrors beyond imagination. Skulls lined in cabinets. Severed heads in the refrigerator. Jars filled with preserved organs. Acid vats containing decomposing remains. A freezer holding human flesh. All inside the home of the quiet man who lived next door. Neighbors watched in disbelief as evidence bags piled up outside. The man they thought was strange, but harmless, had been hiding a slaughterhouse in plain sight. The world's eyes turned to Milwaukee. Cameras surrounded the courthouse as Dahmer's trial began in January 1992. Dahmer was charged with 15 counts of murder. His defense? Guilty, but insane. His attorneys argued he was driven by uncontrollable urges, by a sickness that robbed him of his humanity. But prosecutors painted a different picture. This was no madness. This was the method. Dahmer knew exactly what he was doing. He lured, drugged, killed, preserved. His crimes required planning, calculation, and deception. The trial lasted weeks, filled with testimony that shook the courtroom. But none were more powerful than the voices of the victims' families. One by one, mothers, fathers, siblings stood before the judge, trembling as they spoke about the sons and brothers they had lost. Some wept uncontrollably, begging the court to see the humanity behind the names. Others erupted in anger, screaming at Dahmer, demanding answers he would never give. The most famous moment came from Rita Isbell, the sister of Errol Lindsay. Overcome with rage, she lunged toward Dahmer in the courtroom, shouting, "You don't know what that man put my brother through. I hate you." Her raw pain, captured on camera, became one of the most unforgettable images of the trial. And through it all, Dahmer sat quietly, sometimes with a blank stare, sometimes with an eerie calm, offering apologies that many found hollow. In February 1992, the jury delivered its verdict. Jeffrey Dahmer was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 15 consecutive life sentences, 957 years behind bars. The family sighed in relief. Justice had finally been served. Or so it seemed. But Jeffrey Dahmer's story did not end in the courtroom. Prison would bring him fate even if he could not escape. And in the cold walls of Columbia Correctional Institution, his dark journey reached its final chapter. After his conviction in 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Inside those cold walls, Dahmer was no longer the monster hiding in plain sight, he was inmate number 177252. At first, he was kept in protective isolation, separated from the general prison population. Guards feared that his crimes, and the notoriety surrounding them, made him a target. And they were right. But Dahmer didn't fight it. In fact, in several interviews, he seemed strangely resigned. He told reporters he deserved death. He admitted that if he could take back what he had done, he would. He said he knew he could never be free again. In rare TV interviews, Dahmer's tone was unsettling. Calm. Measured. Almost detached. He spoke about his crimes not with anger, but with chilling matter-of-fact honesty. He confessed in detail, how he felt lonely, how he wanted control, how his fears of abandonment drove him to murder. He even spoke about faith. In prison, Dahmer began reading the Bible. Some reports said he found God, and that he was baptized in 1994. To some, it was a sign of remorse. To others, it was manipulation, another mask, like the one he wore in life. But prison was not peaceful for Dahmer. Other inmates despised him, not only for his crimes but also for how he behaved inside. Some guards claimed Dahmer would make jokes in the cafeteria, shaping his food into body parts, pouring ketchup on them, and saying things like, "This is what I used to do." For prisoners who had lost friends or family to violence, this wasn't dark humor, it was a provocation. It was cruel. And eventually, it caught up to him. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to work cleaning bathrooms alongside two other inmates, Jesse Anderson, a convicted murderer, and Christopher Scarver, a man serving a life sentence for homicide. But the guards left them unsupervised. Moments later, Scarver attacked. With a metal bar from the prison weight room, he bludgeoned Dahmer. Then, he turned the weapon on Jesse Anderson. By the time guards returned, Dahmer lay on the floor, his skull shattered. He was pronounced dead less than an hour later. The man who had taken 17 lives, had lost his own. When news of Dahmer's death broke, reactions were immediate and divided. Some families of victims felt relief. One mother told reporters she finally slept soundly for the first time in years. Others believed Dahmer's death cheated them of true justice, ending his punishment too soon. The public, meanwhile, was captivated. Headlines spread worldwide. For some, Dahmer's death was symbolic, evil had been destroyed. For others, it sparked new fears. If monsters like Dahmer could exist, who else might be walking free, hidden in plain sight? Milwaukee, in particular, was left scarred. The city became synonymous with Dahmer's name. The apartment building where he had lived was eventually demolished, residents refusing to let it stand as a monument to horror. But the legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer lingers far beyond Milwaukee. His crimes raised questions about how society identifies danger. How neighbors ignored the smells, the sounds, the strange behavior. How police dismissed calls for help, even returning a 14-year-old victim, Conrad Synthasunphone, to Dahmer's hands, believing his lies over a terrified child's truth. The failures were staggering. And the warning signs were clear, yet missed. A lonely child fascinated with death. A teenager isolated, drinking heavily, slipping deeper into darkness. A man arrested multiple times, released again and again. Jeffrey Dahmer was not just one man's evil. He was also a reflection of society's blind spots. Behind the sensational headlines and the gruesome details, we must not forget the real story, the 17 young men whose lives were stolen. Sons, brothers, friends, many of them young men of color, ignored by a system that failed to protect them. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not overshadowed. The dark story of Jeffrey Dahmer is not just about a killer. It is about neglect, oversight, and the haunting truth that evil can hide in plain sight. It is about the price of silence, and the cost of looking away. And as history remembers Jeffrey Dahmer, let us also remember his victims, and the lessons we cannot afford to ignore. If you've stayed with us through this dark journey, take a moment to honor the victims by sharing their story. Do you believe Dahmer's death was justice, or an escape from true punishment? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, evil often wears an ordinary face. Stay aware, stay safe. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is not just about one man's evil, it's about the warning signs that went unnoticed, the voices that were ignored, and the cracks in society that allowed unspeakable horrors to unfold. From a lonely child fascinated with bones, to a young man dismissed as just troubled, to a predator living undetected in an ordinary apartment building, Dahmer's path reveals not just his own darkness, but our collective failure to see it. Every missed opportunity, the police calls dismissed, the neighbors' complaints brushed aside, the victims overlooked because of who they were, added up to tragedy. And those tragedies left scars that will never fully heal. Families torn apart. Communities haunted. A city marked forever by one man's crimes. But perhaps, by remembering, we can learn. Perhaps, by not looking away, we can prevent history from repeating. Evil does not always appear in monstrous form. Sometimes, it hides in the face of a quiet neighbor, the man next door, the one you'd never suspect. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer forces us to confront a difficult truth: silence, ignorance, and indifference can be just as dangerous as the evil itself. If this story gripped you, if it made you think, don't let it end here. Hit the like button to let us know you want more stories uncovered. Subscribe so you never miss another journey into the darkest corners of true crime. And share this video with someone who should know the truth, because stories like this are not just entertainment. They are warnings. And now, I want to hear from you. Do you believe Jeffrey Dahmer was born a killer, destined for darkness? Or was he shaped by his broken environment, his isolation, and a system that failed to intervene? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. This has been the dark story of Jeffrey Dahmer. Remember the victims. Learn from the warning signs. And never forget that evil often hides in plain sight.